music and worship go together. We can see back in the Old Testament, think of Psalm 150 or the dedication of the temple in Chronicles. Singers and instruments of all sorts making a joyous noise unto the Lord. So music has always been part of worship in all sorts of different religious traditions. In the Western Church, the music, of course, developed, and most famous music from medieval times is the Gregorian chant, which in many Episcopal churches is still used because it's easy to sing, and it's, if you know how, it's quite popular even in the 21st century. In the Continental Reformation, because we're a church of the Reformation, Martin Luther was very keen on music. He was a musician. And so he used music as an evangelical tool. And we still sing some of his hymns. Now thank we all our God. A mighty fortress is our God. The great German chorale tradition built on, and he was part of that development musically. So Luther liked hymnody, but by contrast, Calvin, who was the Swiss reformer, and our Anglican tradition took more from Calvin than from Luther, especially with regard to music. And he was a bit against music. He thought music excited the senses, and that was dangerous. He was all for sort of the intellect, just the word and no adornment. And so music was given a much lower place. And indeed, the only acceptable music in many Calvinist circles, and particularly the most extreme example would be the church in Scotland. They very much use the... Everything working all right? Oh, no. The church in Scotland, the Presbyterian church in Scotland, banned all music altogether, except for the only acceptable music was what was called the Metrical Psalm. That's, psalms were thought to be okay because they'd always been part of, they were biblical and been part of worship for a long time, from Jewish times onwards. And the Metrical Psalm was a way of saying or singing psalms unaccompanied to sort of very rhythmic, easy to sing music. But that was about the only music that was acceptable. In the English Reformation, which in the mid-16th century, the Book of Common Prayer, which is the sort of the benchmark, if you like, of the English Reformation, provided for two services, particularly where there was a lot of music, matins and evensong, morning prayer and evening prayer. And in the Book of Common Prayer, 1549 and 1552 and 1559, and then 1662 eventually, they provided for an anthem, they provided for the canticles, the Magnificat, the Nunc Dimittis, which we still use in worship, and they said, these may be said or sung. So that said or sung tradition was there in the Book of Common Prayer, enshrined in the Book of Common Prayer. And same with the responsory prayers, like we said at morning prayer this morning. We responded in versicles and responses, and they could be said or sung. So there was an allowance for music in the English Reformation tradition, and but only one hymn was provided for in the Book of Common Prayer, and that was the Latin hymn, the Veni Creator, Come Holy Ghost, our souls inspire, which was used in the ordination of priests and bishops. So, strangely enough, we think of hymns as being very Anglican. Well, the only hymn provided was one old Latin hymn. We'll come back to hymns later on. The composers of the time, and particularly people like Marbeck and Byrd and Gibbons, names we might recognise, who'd written, of course, for Latin texts, they moved over and started to write the English texts for the Reformed Church. So they wrote wonderful anthems and the like. Can you hear all right? Yeah. They wrote for the church service. They wrote for the canticles and for the responses. Very much for morning and evening prayer, and not a great deal was provided for in the Eucharist. What was called Holy Communion. There wasn't the same provision of music for Holy Communion at that, although in certain places, and the sort of exception to the general rule was there were three classes of religious houses of worship which were a bit different from the parish church. There was the chapels royal, as chapels associated with the king or queen. There were the cathedrals, and there were college chapels. And they tended to use Latin because it was the learned tongue. And so the Reformation principle was to use language understood by the people. So in the ordinary parish churches, that was English. But in some of these special places, Latin was still used. So the composers had a field day. They wrote both in Latin and in English. And it tended to be that the chapels royal and the college chapels and the cathedrals kept some sort of choral tradition. And they were the places where music was really protected, I suppose, and provided a wonderful tradition which eventually seeped back into regular parish life. Well, that's a little bit about from those sources, if you like, develop what we call the English cathedral tradition. But that really doesn't develop really until the 18th and 19th century particularly. There's a very low period in terms of church music after the Reformation, except in some of those special places. The Calvinist sort of doctrine prevailed, which very suspicious of too much adornment of worship. And you'll remember in the English Civil War, the Puritans, they were dominant, and of course they abolished music altogether. And then sadly they smashed up organs and choirs were disbanded and all the rest of it. So it was a very dark period in English church history. Think about hymns for a minute. Just this morning, we sang a Latin hymn, or the two choruses did, the Tantum Ergo. And so there's a tradition of Latin hymns, like I mentioned, the Veni Creator being provided for in the Book of Common Prayer. And we still sing Latin hymns in translation, like the Tantum Ergo we sang this morning. But you think of hymns like the Pangue Lingua, Now My Tongue the Mystery Telling, or the Te Lucis Antiterma. They're all ancient hymns written in Latin, but we sing them before the ending of the day, is the Te Lucis Antiterma. And there are many others in the book. But hymnody, as we know it today, is really an 18th century development. Up to that point, it was largely, I would say, metrical psalms, and occasionally the old Latin hymns were used in certain places. But it was really with the evangelical movement and the Wesleyan movement that hymnody as we know it today started to become popular. You remember the Wesley Brothers, John and Charles?
Right.
That's right, absolutely. I won the first hymn this morning. Well, they wrote 600 hymns between them, with words and music, and they used them very tellingly in their evangelical services, as a way of bringing people together, as a way of doing theology. Wesley hymns are full of good theology, and it's sort of what we might call popular theology. When you think about it, many of us have, our theology is very formed by the hymns we sing, both for good and for bad, I have to say, because we do sing some verging on heresy. So, thinking about that evangelical movement, think of the hymns of Isaac Watts, "O God, our help in ages past." Right? He's one of the early evangelicals who wrote, "Even when I survey the wondrous cross," Isaac Watts. And I mentioned the Wesleys. Think of John Newton, "Amazing Grace," and it's almost like an American national anthem or an additional anthem. I mean, you've got to think about the theology sometimes, and that's a very good example. I mean, when you talk about yourself as a wretch like me, I'm never quite sure if I really quite approve of that. It's a very Calvinistic view of the world. However, we love the hymn because it speaks to us on all sorts of occasions. And then the tunes became important. I mean, a tune can make the words come alive. Think of that tune by the English composer called Croft, and he wrote a tune called Saint Anne, which we know so well. God, our help in ages past. It's easy to sing. We recognise it immediately. It's congregational. Not a difficult tune to sing. It's very. And you'll think of his tune Hanover, "O worship the King, all glorious about." I'm not meant to sing. It's a bit frustrating giving a lesson on music, but you know your hymns well enough. But sometimes they use words by famous poets, and some of you know the hymns by the poet George Herbert, "King of Glory, King of Peace." "Teach me, my God and King." They're just his poems set to music, and sometimes very effectively. And later on in the Oxford movement, that's the High Church movement in the 19th century, there was a great move to translate some of the great Greek and Latin hymns. And John Mason Neale is a name you often think of, who translated over hundreds of Latin hymns to bring them into the English-speaking world. And hymnody developed both sides of the Atlantic. And at first, the American colonies would have used the Metrical Psalms. There were two compilations which were popular, and they would have used those where people sing. And in the 19th century, there was also the great evangelist. Who's heard of Moody and Sankey? Sacred Songs and Solos. That was a great compilation of evangelical hymns. And I had my great-grandfather's copy. He was a Baptist, and the Baptists loved Moody and Sankey. And it was part of the American evangelical revival. Hymn books, as we know them, the first English hymn book was 1861. So it's very late in the piece. You think we've always had hymns, and we haven't. They're very much a 19th century or late 18th century, 19th century phenomenon. So in the 19th century, 1861 was the first major English hymnal called Hymns Ancient and Modern. And when we were at seminary, we used to call them old and mouldy. But they were a very important compilation of hymns. And then another famous hymn book is the English hymnal, came out in 1906. The Episcopal Church, we have the hymnal today of 1983, well, its first predecessor was 1892. And there were major revisions in 1916, 1940, and 1983. So about every 40 years or so, or 30 years, there's a new hymn book comes out, keeping some of the old and introducing some new. There's been a lot of hymn writing through the 19th, 20th, into the 21st century. A friend of mine in Australia has just received a woman priest. She writes wonderful hymns and has just been honoured by the federal government, given a medal for her work in hymn writing. So she writes terrific words and then often uses tunes that we already know. And her name's Elizabeth Smith, and she's written, 5 or 6 compilations of hymns. So it's a living art, which is good because, as I say, it's important that the hymns express what we believe, and that also they reflect our contemporary understanding of the world. So hymn writing is a living thing. And in terms of parish hymns, some people say, we've got to have this and got to have that. Well, there are no hymns set down as they happen to be used. There's a lot of hymns in the book and beyond. And it's good to have a rich hymn tradition, because a good hymn can have a terrific effect on a congregation. And there's nothing quite like a church full of people singing a great hymn, and it will lift you up and give you great strength and encouragement. Just thinking about, and I'm going to talk more about hymns at the next session on the 25th. Think about organs. Again, we just assume that churches have organs. Well, it ain't always so. And really, the organ is a development of the late 18th, again 19th century. There have been organs around since ancient times, some sort of organ, an organ-type instrument that is driven by wind. But there are very few that survive. As I said, in the English Reformation, there was a lot of smashing of organs. There weren't all that many around anyhow, but the ones that were there tended to be wrecked by the Puritans. They didn't like them. They thought they were instruments of the devil. But really, the organ as we know it today is the development of the late 17th century in North Germany. And the organ developed into the 18th century. When you think of Bach, Bach was a great exponent of the organ. It was the organ of St. Thomas Leipzig, which is still working. And it was in Germany, in northern Germany, they developed a pedal board. The old organs, those that were in England, there are a couple of survivors, don't have any pedal board. That was a German invention. So really, in terms of England and America, the great period of the organ was the 19th century. And organs took off in England, and they took off in this country. And they are still taking off in this country. I don't know how many organ builders there are around in the United States at present. I would think there are about 100. And some of them are building very fine instruments. And it's very interesting, in the last 10 years, the parishes in Manhattan that have built new organs, or are building them, like Trinity at present. Grace Church Broadmoor had a new organ, Ascension built a new organ, St. Thomas has built a new organ, Holy Trinity did one about 20 years ago, and so it goes on. Transfiguration, back in the 80s, or late 80s or early 90s. So organ building is a living art, and organs being built and rebuilt all the time as we speak. And they've become an important accompaniment to church worship. But what happened before there were organs? Well, various things happened. In some English parish churches, there tends to be a balcony at the back of the church. And there a group of singers, if they had going to have some music, some singers would be there. And they'd have a parish band or orchestra. Maybe 2 or 3 instruments, and they would accompany the singers. And so there was a tradition of instrumental music where there was no organ. As I say, the organ was a fairly late development. There are other ways of doing music. It doesn't have to be an organ. And some of you know that in a more charismatic or evangelical church, they have a praise band. If you look on television and see these funerals in different parts of the church in this country, you'll see a band very much up front playing the music. And often you see it on the nightly television of the funeral of a police officer or something, perhaps up in the Bronx or in Harlem, and they have a band playing the music. Well, that's another way of doing music in church. And in some places they use a piano. Some of you may remember the old days of the harmonium or the American organ. I have one. My father bought one when I was 15, because I used to play the pipe organ. And he found someone was selling a harmonium. Yeah, you pedal away like that. And I often associate it with country churches in Australia, where I come from. They often had a harmonium and someone, industriously pumping away and playing what we called a squeeze box. And depending how hard you pump, how good the sound was. If you're a bit weak with your knees, well, it didn't make such a good sound. So organs, pipe organs, we know it is a very important part of church worship, but it's not the only way of doing music. And last but not least, think about choirs. As I said, the survival of the English choral tradition really came about through the rather protected chapels associated with the monarch, with the Oxford and Cambridge colleges, and with the cathedrals. They were able to maintain some sort of choral tradition. But what is interesting is the development in the 19th century, particularly of the men and boys choir, or the development as we know it today. That tradition was there. It went back to medieval times, in fact, and was maintained in the, as I say, in the chapels royal and the Oxford colleges, and some of the cathedrals. But its sort of development was a great 19th century phenomenon, and became sort of de rigueur to have a men and boys choir. Now, just for examples in the city, for instance, St Thomas's Fifth Avenue has a famous men and boys choir. In fact, they have the only choir school left in the country, or maybe two. But that's an important part of their life. And where I came from, when I was rector for 11 years at Transfiguration, we had a men and boys choir. In fact, it was established in 1880 and was the longest surviving men and boys choir in the country. There were older ones, but they've gone, sadly, including Grace Church in Newark. So that tradition is one that we're familiar with, but we think of choirs as being always robed. That's a very late phenomenon. That was part of the High Church movement in the English Church of the 19th century, what called the ritualist movement, which came out of the sort of the earlier Oxford movement. And this fun little story aside, there was a High Church, Anglo-Catholic church in my home city of Melbourne, which introduced the first robed choir in the 1880s, I think. And the bishop of the day refused to go to the church because of the choir. He thought it was sort of getting near to being a Roman Catholic. But so we take it for granted the choir's up front. And that's the other thing. They like them robed, but they also like them in the chancel, on either side of the chancel, rather than in the gallery at the back. And that was what they thought they were doing is recreating the medieval church. That's a whole other discussion, but choirs don't have to be either side of the chancel. That's where we think of them traditionally in a Gothic church. But if you go to St Luke's in the Fields, for instance, down in the village, their choir is in the balcony at the back. And that was deliberately done after the fire. They put a gallery in rather than having the choir either side of the chancel. So it's a question of how you're going to do the liturgy, and we'll talk about that next time. But they're just some insights into things we perhaps take for granted about hymns and organs and choirs, a little bit about the history of the tradition. But you might like to ask some questions. But next time we'll look at the relationship between music and the liturgy and how that interacts and how important one is to the other, issues around that. So thank you for listening. And perhaps, are there any questions?
So there are, from what I understand, there are no rules or regulations about what could be used as a hymn during a service. I mean, could you have all Beatles music?
No, well, that's a question we'll look at next time particularly.
Oh, okay.
And the question is, what serves the liturgy? That's the sort of, and in terms of words, are they words that are theological? Do they enhance what we're trying to teach? Or are they just simply secular words?
But is that up to the individual parish rector, or does it come from on high?
No, it doesn't come from on high. But,
Okay.
I mean, from on high comes the hymnal, but it's not mandated we use only the hymnal. But canonically, the rector has the choice of hymns, but normally consult with the musician and often with the people. People say they like certain hymns and not certain hymns. You get a sort of parish tradition of hymn singing, but we'll talk about that. It's a good question because it comes up, and Elise will know that weddings. What music can be sung at weddings? And if you had anything to do with a church wedding, it can become a very sore issue because people want, very secular song or something, a popular song of the day, and the rector says, "You can't sing that." And it causes a deal of excitement. We had a lot of weddings at Transfiguration. That was a very popular wedding church, and so we had certain rules about what could be sung and what couldn't be sung.
Some of you may or may not remember from the early 2000s, there was a wave of U2-chorists.
Oh, yes.
Kind of like that, Beatles music, using the music of U2 as the entire service.
Oh, okay.
U2-chorists.
Do you remember that in this diocese we had the hip-hop Eucharists? There was a priest up in Harlem, and he got a hip-hop group going, and they did the hip-hop Eucharist. I remember at a convention or something, we had a hip-hop. They did a sort of demonstration. It was quite something. But music's very important evangelistically. And so if you're working with, say, young people, you don't sing a Latin hymn. You probably sing something more appropriate to that group. All right.
One more question?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
After in the United States, after the Revolution, was there any movement to divide the music from what had been sung in Britain and to have? No,
it was really the same tradition on both sides of the Atlantic, but in the 18th century it was fairly limited. It was very much the sort of the metrical psalm would have been the sort of things that would have been sung in Virginia or in an Episcopal church in Church of England in New York, say Trinity. Much the same. Yeah. But the development of hymnody took place on both sides of the Atlantic. And the Wesleys, English, but there were lots of hymns come out of this country. Some using folk music.
Do they use any of our hymns, what we would think of, hymns based on American folk song? Are any of those used in Britain or Australia, Canada?
No, tend not to be. It's very interesting. One of the things that really struck me when I came to seminary back in the 80s was how distinctive the American hymn tradition is. And it's not the words so much, it's the tunes. Because the tunes, hymns are written sort of as hymns, not always, rarely with a tune. And the tunes are matched with the hymn. So there's obviously musicians working everywhere. And there are many hymns in common with same tunes. But if you go to church and there's a favourite hymn that's the wrong tune, it can wreck your experience. And I sometimes, early on, was like, wrong tune. Well, there's actually no right tune. And that's often, again, what people, where they've grown up and what they've got used to.
It's like Christmas. I remember as a child, the tune for A Little Town of Bethlehem was entirely different from the one they always use now. And
I couldn't stand it.
You know the one that gets me every Christmas is Away in a Manger.
Oh,
Because it's da 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 da. We sing Away in a Manger. So it's those small. They do. Hymns are ingrained into us, particularly if you've grown up in a church environment. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Nice audience.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We look forward to it. So I'll be here in 2 weeks' time.
2 weeks from today, yes.
oh, great.
Oh, you'll be here in 2 weeks.
2 weeks, the 25th.
Yes.
Where was everybody? Yeah, that was great. Did we chorus? I sing in the choir here,
I
and
know
so I
you do.
miss it
I know you
sorely, and so this is as close as we could get.
Well, questions are helpful because I like responding to questions. So perhaps next time you can raise an issue about what words and what music, because it's very relevant actually to the whole liturgical question. Well, what are we trying to do? As we
I will think of some questions.
do, please.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Horace. Horace, there we are. I'm presenting one blessed month.
So I'll see you in 2 weeks.
See you in 2 weeks. I'll be back. I'll probably come to the 10:30. Sit in the congregation.
10:30. When?
Well,
Oh, when you come back?
Yeah.
Oh, you don't want to sit up there?
no.
Ah, okay. All right.
I'll speak to Roy because he'll be around.
That's good.